Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be covering the second book of Samuel. But before we get into that, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe because it helps me out a ton and it really helps the videos get out there. But without further ado, let's get into the book of Samuel. So the book starts off with the death of Saul and his son Jonathan. Saul was badly hurt and he did not want to be captured, so he just fell on his blade and he ended himself. And then when a messenger came to David, he had told David about their deaths. And then the messenger, thinking there was going to be a reward for him, he told David that he was the one who killed Saul. And the messenger brought Saul's crown and his bracelets to prove to David that Saul was dead. But David was upset by this because Saul was God's anointed king. And even though David and Saul were like enemies, David still respected Saul as the king, and he also, cried deeply for the both of them, Saul and his son Jonathan. And Jonathan and David were actually really close friends. So this had a big impact on David, and he actually wrote a song about it. And then David thought it was a serious crime that the messenger had killed King Saul, so David had him executed. Now, David did not become king just yet, but he was king of the tribe of Judah, which is the southern part of Israel. And then David asked God where he should go, and God told him to go to the city of Hebron. And then Saul's son becomes king of Israel, and this ignites a rivalry between him and David. And then a battle takes place between the men of David and the men of Ishbosheth. I'm just going to call him Ish because his name is really hard to pronounce, which ended in a big fight with a lot of casualties. And then the battle between Abner and Joab's armies continued after the one-on-one fights. Abner's side was losing and many men were killed, and then Joab's brother, Asahel, was fast and chased after Abner. Abner warned him to stop, but Asahel kept chasing, so Abner killed him with a spear, and this angered Joab, and the fight became even more intense. And then Abner and Joab realized how much damage they had been doing to each other, so they just called a truce. And then a war was going on between David and Ishmael. Ishmael was losing a lot, and David was becoming, better, and he was winning. And then David has a bunch of wives and sons. This holds relevance later in the story. And then Ish accused Abner, the commander of Saul's army, of sleeping with one of Saul's concubines, and then Abner got upset and he joined David's side. But David had some terms for Abner. For Abner and David to make peace, David had asked Abner to give him back his wife because Saul had given David's wife to Abner, and Abner was just like, bet, okay. And then as soon as David and his wife reunited, it wasn't a happy reunion because, for that time, she was married to another man, and so David and Abner made an agreement to make peace with each other. And then Joab was suspicious of Abner, so he decided to smoke him. And then David was really upset that Abner had died, but he made it public that he wasn't the one who did it, and he mourned Abner's death. And then Joab explained that the reason why he did it was for his brother, and then David was like, yo, I still don't approve of that. And then David orders a public funeral for Abner. And then Ish, who is still king of Israel, by the way, his army was weak, and then two of his commanders killed him behind his back. And then they cut off his head and took it to David, hoping that they would earn his favor and they could just end the rivalry. And then just like with the person previously, David still respected Ish because he was the king of Israel. And then when the people brought him their head, or his head, David didn't approve of this and he smoked them both. And then David buried Ish he gave him like a proper burial out of respect for Saul's family. And yeah, he just gave him a proper burial. And then David was anointed the king of Israel, and then the tribes come together and they're like, yay, David! And then David starts making like key decisions for Israel. One of his decisions was to take Jerusalem and make it the capital of Israel. And then David captured Jerusalem and then renamed it to the city of David. And then David becomes even more stronger as king. And then David had some more children, and his kingdom starts to rapidly grow. And then the Philistines wanted to go to war with Israel, and then David asked God what he should do, and then God was just like, go right ahead, do it. And then the Israelites, or, David, he won and then gave credits to God. And then there was another battle, and David goes up to God, and he asks him for new instructions. God then tells him to wait, and then strike. David does this, he wins, and then gives credits to God. And then David decided, yo, I'm gonna go get the Ark of the Covenant and bring it here, and that's exactly what he did. And then they were about to bring the ark back to, where David was, but they didn't do it right, and the ark was about to fall off, and Uzzah saw it, a guy, he was one of the dudes that was handling it, and when he went to go touch it, only priests are allowed to touch the ark, so he just died. But David did not want to take the ark to Jerusalem just yet because he was afraid of its power. So instead, he leaves it at a guy. Let me see if I can say his name right. He leaves it at a guy's house of Odom. I could be saying his name wrong. Obed-Edom. Okay, yeah, that was his name. Never mind. And then the ark stayed there for like 3 months. And throughout that time, God blessed Edom a bunch. And then this time, David did... Oh my goodness, bro, listen to this. David decided to let the priest handle it, and when he did, David just starts hitting the boogie. I'm talking...
Get it, David. Get it, David.
Get it, David. It literally says in scripture that David danced with all his might. And then David... oh my goodness, bro, listen to this. And then David's wife criticizes him for worshiping God. Well, she didn't criticize him for worshiping God. She criticized him for dancing, but he was doing it to worship God, so, And, bless David's heart. He was like, man, I don't care what anybody thinks. I'm worshiping God. And because of her disrespect, she didn't have any kids. And then David wanted to have a temple for the ark because he thought it was weird. He thought it wasn't good that the ark was sitting in a tent while he was living in a palace. Yo, bro, we're gonna have fun. Just keep listening. We're gonna have a good time. And then the prophet Nathan had told David, yo, bro, just go ahead and do it. And then later that night, God went and told Nathan, because he was speaking to Nathan, he was like, Nathan, tell David that to not build the temple. He's not going to be the one to build it because David has spilt blood and, it just wouldn't be right. And then God promised that David's son would be the one to build the temple. We're going to get into him later. Listen to this. And then God basically told David that he would raise David's son, Solomon. He would raise his son up, Solomon, to build the temple, and he would correct him, and he would love him, and he would basically be a father to Solomon, and that if Solomon sinned, he would correct him. And next, David got onto his knees, and he started thanking God for everything God had given him. And he felt that he was unworthy, but he just prayed and he was like, thank you, God, I really appreciate this. And then David and the Philistines go to war with each other, and David hit them so hard that he actually took some of their territory, and he took some of the keys to their cities too. This victory made David an even stronger king. Not only that, the Philistines were subjected to him. And then David turned his attention to the Moabites, which was a neighboring nation. He captured them and made them pay tribute to, Israel, which basically meant that they either had to give David money or gifts. And then David defeats the army of King Hadadezer. Basically, he defeats his army and becomes an even stronger king. And then David basically took the riches of Hebedezer's nation, and he took them back to Israel. And later on, this was going to be used for the construction of God's temple. And then as David's, empire starts to get bigger, he starts to implement, officers and commanders. One of them was Joab, his nephew. And then David made sure that justice would happen throughout the land. He punished the wrongdoers, and he rewarded those who were faithful to him. And then in the midst of all that, David remembers the promise that he made to Jonathan, his homie, and he tried finding out that if Saul had any more family so he could show kindness to them. And then David found out that Jonathan actually had a son, which his name was Mephibosheth. I'm just going to call him Chef. Chef was injured as a child, and this crippled him for the rest of his life, and then David wanted to pay kindness to him. Also, please forgive me if I'm calling some of these people, they're not their names, if I'm not calling them by their names. It's because their names are, really hard to pronounce. And then David asked Seth that if he wanted to come to the palace to live with him, and David would go on to treat Seth like his own son, and he also gave Seth the land that belonged to Saul and Jonathan to him. And then he went up to his servant Ziba. David went up to his servant Ziba and was like, yo, you're going to take care of Seth's land because of his disability. And Ziba was a servant to Saul before, he passed away. And then Seth was very grateful that David had done all these things for him. And Seth called himself a dead dog compared to David's greatness. And then Nahash, king of the Ammonites, had died, and his son had taken over. And then David, to show his what's the word? Condolences. David decided to show his condolences by sending some men over there. But Hanun, which was the king of the Ammonites' son's name, but Hanun thought they were spies, so to humiliate them, he cut their beards wrongly, and then he ripped up their clothes, and then they had to go back home in shame. And then they returned home, and David was really mad about this because, you know, he just was trying to show his condolences, and the men were just like so beat up and humiliated. And then David told the men to go to Jericho so they wouldn't be humiliated any further. And David just straight up prepares to go to war with the Ammonites because of this. And then Hanun, fearing David, decided that he was going to hire mercenaries to defend off David and his army. And then Joab, which is, one of David's commanders, when he's about to go into battle with them, he splits his army into two, one to fight the Ammonites and one to fight the Arameans, the ones that, were mercenaries to be hired. Basically, the ones that got hired to fight David's army. Basically, the Arameans lost badly, and then Joab's army chased them out. And then after that, the Ammonites were quickly defeated. And then the Arameans returned again, trying to go to war with Israel. And then David was like, yo, let me get up. And he leads his army to fight the Arameans, and he whoops their butt. And then, David sees a woman named Bathsheba, and he sees her bathing on her rooftop. And this was in spring, so all of the men are at war. And, he saw her, sent for her, and he slept with her. Also, I should mention this, her husband's name was Uriah. Keep that in mind. And then David hoped that Uriah would come home to his wife and sleep with her. That way, he could say that the kid was actually Uriah's. But Uriah was actually very loyal to his soldiers, so he stayed at the battlefield. And then David invites Uriah to a meal, hoping to get him drunk so he could send him home. But Uriah, even in his drunken state, he still wanted to, serve his fellow soldiers, so he just stayed at the battlefield. And then David tried to cover up his sin, so he sent Uriah to the front lines, hoping that Uriah was going to die. And then Uriah dies, by the way, and then a messenger is sent to David, illustrating that he died. And there were other casualties too, so it just made it look like Uriah just went out with a boom. And then Bathsheba, she's torn about this, so she starts to mourn Uriah. And then the prophet Nathan was sent to David, and he basically told him a parable, and this is what the parable was. He told a story about a rich man who took a poor man's only lamb to serve a guest, even though he had plenty of his own. And then he asked David, he's like, what do you think should happen to this man? And then David's like, he should be put to death. And then Nathan is like, you did that! Nathan proceeds to go on like, bro, you did that. You're the one who did that. He basically goes on to say that David is the sinner in this scenario, and that to punish him, God's gonna smoke David's baby boy. And then before that, he also went on to say that David's wives would be given to other people in public disgrace. And he also said that the sword would never leave his home. And then David seeks repentance, and and obviously God forgives him, but the consequences are still on the table. This is still gonna happen to him. And then David prayed and fasted, hoping that God would change his mind on the baby, but he didn't, and the baby ended up dying. And then he comforted Bathsheba, which, she was torn about this as well. And later on, they had a new son named Solomon. You're about to find out who do this. And then later, Solomon becomes the new king. And then God sent the prophet Nathan to David, basically saying that Solomon is going to be the new king, and he will be called Jedidah, which means beloved of the Lord. And then David captures Rabbah, and Rabbah is the capital of the Ammonites. It's the capital of their town or city. And then Amnon, which is David's son by another wife, had a crush on his half-sister. What was her name? Tamar. He had a crush on his half-sister Tamar, and that love soon turned into lust, and he wanted to do the deed with her. And he tried to shake the feeling of it because it was his sister, but he couldn't get rid of these feelings. And then Jonadab, which is Amnon's cousin, basically, he gave him some wicked advice, and he told him, yo, just act sick, and then she'll come and take care of you, and you can take advantage of the situation. And this is the part of the story where things get dark. Amnon violates his sister. If you guys get what I'm trying to say. And Tamar wanted him to stop because she knew it was a wicked thing to do. And then after he violated her, he decided that he wanted to reject her and he hated her. And Tamar had to leave with her clothes ripped up. And it's kind of just I don't know, man. Like, this part of the story just kind of makes me feel terrible. And then Tamar went to her brother's house, Absalom. I could be saying his name wrong, but she goes to Absalom's house and she basically tells Absalom what happened to her. And Absalom told her to be quiet, but he was very angry with Amnon, and he actually started plotting his revenge. And then David found out, but he didn't do anything. And then Absalom organizes a feast, and then he invited all of David's sons there, and, Amnon went there. By the way, this was 2 years after he did what he did, and Amnon dies. By the way, I'm sorry if I'm starting to get quiet. That part of the story kind of just shook me a little bit. But basically, Absalom organizes a feast, and then he invites all of David's sons there, and then Amnon goes there and he orders his servants to kill Amnon, and then all the other sons flee thinking that they were next. And then Absalom flees to a place called Geshur, I could be saying that wrong, and he stayed with his grandmother and fearing David. And then David mourns his son, but he doesn't punish Absalom immediately. And then Joab, one of the leaders of David's army, sees that David is grieving, and he decides to send a woman over to David. And the woman basically just makes up a story that her sons were murdered and that she wanted justice. And then Joab did this in hopes that it would make David realize that he did not want to smoke Absalom and that he wanted him to come home. Basically, this was Joab's desperate attempt at getting David and Absalom to be together again. And then the woman basically tells David a parable, and this is what it said. A parable about a woman who had 2 sons. One son killed the other, and the people wanted to execute the surviving son. But the woman asked David to protect the remaining son, saying that he was all that she had left. And she pointed out that God forgives and shows mercy, and David should do the same for Absalom. The story, moved David and made him think about his own situation for Absalom. And then David was like, okay, I won't smoke Absalom, but he should still be punished for what he did. And then, he finds out that Joab had an involvement with this, and he confirms it, and he's like, yeah, and he's like, bet, okay, I won't smoke Absalom. And then David did allow Absalom to stay in the city of Jerusalem, but Absalom wasn't able to talk to his dad, and David made it clear that he did not want Absalom to see his face, and this went on for 2 years, and this created a distance relationship between father and son. And then Absalom sent a request to Joab to meet with his dad, but Joab ignored it, and, Absalom, he's getting pretty upset at this point, so he sends some of his servants to burn down Joab's fields. So, and this kind of had to force Joab to go speak with Absalom, and then Joab agrees to take Absalom to his dad. And then Absalom and David, rekindle, and what's his name? Absalom bows down to David, and then David kisses Absalom, and it's just an act of reconciliation. And then Absalom starts to begin a rebellion against his dad. He would hire horses and chariots without his dad knowing, and then when people would go to how do I say this, to complain to David, Absalom would stop before them, and he would kind of offer them a better solution without regarding his dad. Basically, he was building a rebellion against David, and he was building support amongst the people of Israel. And then Absalom basically tells them, yo, if I were your king, I'd listen to all your problems and I'd make you feel heard. And this kind of, the people of Israel kind of just, loved it. And they turned their hearts away from David and more to Absalom. And then Absalom just, declares himself king of Hebron, which is a place, is a city of Israel. I could be wrong on that. And he sent secret messages to to the tribes of Israel, saying that they should make him king of Hebron, and then they listened, and he became the new king of Hebron. And then David hears that Absalom became the new king of Hebron, and he took his entire household, his trusted servants, and he just flees from Israel, and he hides out in the wilderness. And then while he's in the wilderness, he starts praying to God for guidance and protection. And he basically asks God that, like, Absalom's, like, servants or whatever, turn stupid and, like, mess up a lot. And, like, to, like, protect David. And to protect his people from harm. But it wasn't only, like, David's followers, like, they were, like, really loyal to David. Like, two of the priests also, like, the ones who carried the ark before, like, previously in the story, they actually wanted to come with David to his exile and, you know, just chill out with him. But David saw that it wasn't right, that priests should be, like, with him. So he sent them back to Jerusalem, and he was like, if it's in God's will, I will return to Jerusalem. And then Nopal, I'm just going to call him Nopal. And then Nopal, who was one of David's, like, most trusted servants and, like, followers in general, betrays him and joins Absalom. And David became grieved by this, and he saw that he, like, you know, one of his homies had, like, messed him over. So he prays to God to make Nopal's counsel foolish. And then one of Seth's servants, the person that I mentioned previously in the story that had a disability and was kin to Saul and Jonathan's son, went up to David, and his cart was full of supplies, and he had told David that Seth had stayed back in Jerusalem because he thought Israel was going to be a return to him. This deeply upset David, and David was just like, oh man, this sucks. And then he gave all of, like, Seth's land to Ziba, but Seth's actions won't be revealed until later in the story. And then as David and his servants are walking, there's a guy that comes out and throws stones at David and starts cursing him, saying that he took Saul's throne. And then one of David's servants wanted to kill this dude, but then David was like, man, don't do it. Maybe this is God's way of talking to me. He chose not to retaliate, and he just left everything in God's hands. And then Absalom he was in power, and he started asking for advice, and he asked Ahithophel, I think his name is, I could be wording that wrong. Basically, he asks Ahithophel what he should do, and Ahithophel tells him that he should sleep with David's concubines as an act of boldness, and that's exactly what Absalom did, and he did it in front of all of Israel. And then David sent a spy over to Jerusalem to just gather information. And then Ahithophel instructed to Absalom that he should go ahead and pursue David while he still can, while they're weak and tired. And then Ahithophel tells Absalom that he should go ahead and pursue David's men. And then Hushai basically tells Absalom that he shouldn't do that, and instead he should lead Israel's army. Hushai's goal was to buy David time, and that's exactly what he was doing. He also went on to say that David was a skilled warrior, and if he actually did go against him, then it would be disastrous. And then Absalom follows, Hushai's advice. And then Ahithophel basically got depressed because his counsel was getting rejected, and he offed himself. And then, Absalom sends 2 messengers over to David to basically confirm. And then David got word of this, and he quickly crossed the Jordan River to safety. And then Absalom realizes that David is about to escape, and he gathers an army, and then he leads it to go get David. And then as Absalom closed in on David divided his group into 3 parts. One was made of Joab, his commander. The other was made out of Joab's brother. And the other, I think he led, I could be wrong. And he basically told them to be careful with Absalom because he was still his son. Oh, no. The third charge was basically another dude was in charge of the third group. These names, man, I swear, they're so hard to pronounce. I'm not even kidding. Also, the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. And then Absalom is, like, riding his donkey through the forest, and his hair gets caught on a branch, and he can't get it out. And then one of Joab's people, or soldiers, servants, whatever, reports it back to Joab, and then Joab shows Basically, Absalom dies by Joab's hands. Joab kills him by throwing darts at his heart, him and his armor bearer. And then the messenger went to David, basically to confirm him that they won, but David was more worried about Absalom rather than the victory. And then the first messenger did not tell David about Absalom, but the second one did, and David was very devastated and heartbroken. And then David mourns Absalom's death. And then Joab rebukes David, and he sees that the David crying was kind of like, don't do that in front of your army. It's kind of weird. And then Joab continues to say that, like, you need to be strong for your army. And then David returns to Jerusalem. And then as they're going back into Jerusalem, the guy that was throwing stones at him and cursing him previously in the story was fearing for his life because he thought that David was going to kill him. And then Shammai was like, I think his name was Shammai. Was it Shammai? I don't know. But he was like, oh man, please don't do that. And then David was like, no, don't worry, bro. You're good. Because he had remembered the grace God had shown him. So he was like, why don't I reciprocate it towards this dude? And then David pardons Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son. And what had basically happened is Ziba went up to David and lied and said that Mephibosheth was with Absalom. And then David believed it. And then when David found out the truth, he restored Mephibosheth's land because Ziba just wanted land. Basically, David restored Mephibosheth's land. Whatever his name is. Whatever. On with the story. And then Barzillai, a supporter of David, he basically helped David with, like, food and basically just helped David with provisions. And then David offered him to come live in the palace with them. And then Barzillai was like, no, but I'm too old for that. But can you bless my family instead? And David is like, bet. And he gives Barzillai whatever. Bro, these names, man, I swear, dude. Instead, he wants a blessing, so David gives him a generous blessing. And then a guy named Sheba, I think he was one of the people he was basically from the tribe of Benjamin, and he led a rebellion against David, being like, yo, we have no share in what he says or does, and we are certainly have no inheritance to the son of Jesse. David soon got word of this and sent Joab and his brother to pursue this dude. Okay, I could be reading this wrong, but it says that David had appointed Amasa, who had been loyal to Absalom, as the new commander of his army. As Joab and Amasa met to move against Sheba, Joab pretended to greet Amasa with a friendly hug, but he struck him in the stomach with a sword, killing him. This action removed Amasa from the position and restored Joab as the commander of the army. Oh my goodness, man. And then Sheba, the guy who was leading the rebellion against David, took refuge in a city. And then a woman went up to Joab, because you gotta think, they were like raiding the city to find Sheba. And then the woman goes up to Joab, and she's like, why are you attacking the city? And Joab's like, yo, we're looking for Sheba. And then the wise woman is like, yo, how about we just sell out how about we just sell out, the guy you're looking for, and that way we can get on with our lives. And he's like, bet. So basically they just sell Sheba out to Joab. And then Joab returns to Jerusalem after the rebellion is stopped. And then Israel endured a famine for 3 years. And then when David asked God why this was happening, God told David that it was a result of Saul disobeying an oath to protect the Gibeonites. And he, laid harm to the Gibeonites. And that this sin needed to be addressed. And then David made an agreement with the Gibeonites. And he went up to them trying to make peace. And he's like, yo, what can I do for this to stop? And then the Gibeonites were like, we don't want money and we don't want none of that, but we want 7 members of Saul's bloodline. And he was like, bet. And he gave them to them, obviously sparing, I can't say his name. Give me a second. He spared Mephibosheth. I don't know how to say these names, man. Give me a break. They're hard to pronounce. And then they smoked Saul's descendants, and then they buried them. And then David and his army went to war with the Philistines again. And there were giants, and then they smoked the giants. They didn't smoke them, but they defeated them. I'm putting air quotes because every time a battle happens, someone ends up dying. And then David sings a song of praise. This was basically him expressing his gratitude and gratefulness to God. Pause for a second. Get yourself something to drink. We're almost done here, but get yourself something to drink. Make sure you're hydrated. Have you eaten today? Brush your teeth. as I say, as I hold some Coca-Cola. And then we get around to the last words of David. And that at the end of his life, David shares his final words, and he describes himself as the servant of God who was anointed to be the king of Israel. David expresses that the Lord has made an everlasting covenant with him, a promise that his descendants would rule all over Israel. And then David wanted to have a census of how many people were fighting in wars between Israel and Judah. And this made God mad because it showed that David was relying on the strength of his army rather than trusting in God. And then God gives David like 3 choices on his punishment. Not kidding. He gives him 3 different separate punishes. Basically, God sends a prophet to David, and the prophet gives David 3 options on 3 different punishments. The first one is 7 years of famine. The second one is 3 months of being chased by enemies. And the third is 3 days of a plague. And then David decided to just let it fall in God's hands, and he picked the plague for 3 days. And then the angel of death was almost going to destroy Jerusalem, but then God was moved by compassion and just didn't let it happen. And then David had to go to a local store to buy a threshing floor so he could make it into an altar to stop God from destroying Jerusalem. And he went up to the shopkeeper to go buy it, but then the guy was like, no, just take it for free. And then David's like, I will not offer my God something that costs me nothing. And then God accepts the sacrifice and stops the plague. And then God accepts David's sacrifice and stops the plague. But here's what's crazy about that. David built the altar and offers sacrifices to God. God accepts David's offering and shows mercy by stopping the plague. But God also told David that the site would become the place where the temple would eventually be built, which later happened under Solomon's reign. And that is the entirety of the second book of Samuel. This video took really long to actually do. Yeah, but I'm so glad you made it to the end, and I'm so glad that we were able to come on this journey with each other, and I'm so glad that I was able to teach you something about God and the Bible and just educate you on the matter. But before you click off the video, please consider commenting, and subscribing, because a lot of work actually goes into these videos, and you'd be doing me a great amount of support if you actually did those things. Literally, you have no idea. Even liking the video helps out a lot. But yeah, thank you for watching the video. And yeah. I thank you. I love you. And God bless.